This is Drupal 8, What You Need to Know. My name is Wayne EAKER. I originally gave this presentation at DrupalCamp Michigan, and I'm re-recording it for release on DrupalTutor.com. In this presentation, I'm going to do it's just going to be a brief overview, sort of dog and pony show. Lots of cute animals, and I'm going to show you the best new features of Drupal 8. So specifically, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Drupal 8 development process. I'm going to show you what's new for end users, site builders, themers, and developers. I'm going to talk about the state of Drupal 8 development as of today. And then I'm going to talk about how you can help the effort for Drupal 8 to get Drupal 8 out the door and to make Drupal 8 great. As I said, I'm Wayne EAKER. I'm an independent Drupal developer, site builder, and themer. I'm the maintainer of the Node Gallery and Menu Badges modules, as well as several other modules, and I teach online Drupal training classes at DrupalTutor.com. My Drupal 8 experience, I should say right off the bat, I'm not some super elite core developer. I really just started working on some Drupal 8 work at DrupalCon Portland. I just showed up at the sprints and said, hey, how can I help? I got pointed onto some specific issues. The largest one was sort of a conversion of the update data fetching part of Drupal core, so the part that fetches information about new module updates, and sort of converting that to the new coding style for Drupal 8. In addition, I have already ported the menu badges and link badges modules that I maintain to Drupal 8. I did that back in September, so between those two, I think I have a good feel for the new features of Drupal 8 and the type of experience that module developers are going to feel when they move from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. This talk is not my own alone. This talk has been given by several people before, and it's sort of I've cobbled together the work of a lot of different people. So a lot of different blog posts, other presentations, and so here are some acknowledgments to all those who have come before me and who I got a lot of information from. I've also got extensive footnotes for a lot of add-on blog posts, places where you can go to learn more about each of the topics that I'm covering if you go to wayneaker.com/Drupal8. All right, so let's talk about Drupal 8 development. In January 2011, Drupal 7 was released, and 3 months later, Drupal 8 development began. Drupal 8 development differed from Drupal 7 development in that Dries, the leader of the Drupal project, sort of created a set of lieutenants who were in charge of various initiatives. And so these were the official initiatives of Drupal 8. Mobile, configuration management, HTML5 layouts, multilingual, views and core, and web services. And so there were different people in charge of each of these different initiatives. And by sort of splitting up the work, they've really been able to get quite a lot accomplished over the last 2.5 years. Oh, I should have mentioned actually there were, in addition to those official initiatives, there were a few unofficial initiatives like the Twig, Spark, which is UI improvements, and there were several others. So here we are 2.5 years later. There's been over 1,600 contributors to Drupal 8, which is nearly double that of Drupal 7. This is by far the most changes of any Drupal release. You'll see when we get to the code section, there's been really quite a rewrite of the core system. And I think that Drupal 8 personally positions Drupal to be a content engine across multiple platforms. It's not just for websites anymore. I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the web services part. All right, so what's new in Drupal 8? So let's start with end users. What are end users going to see that's new? First thing, Drupal 8 is way better on mobile phones than Drupal 7. So I have just a few screenshots to sort of demonstrate this. It has all the built-in themes have a responsive design. So here's Bartik, the default theme on Drupal, in Drupal 7 and Drupal 8. So you can see that it's, with the responsive design, it's collapsed down on the phone by default. And I should say all the screenshots in this presentation are all Drupal core. There are no contributed modules or add-on themes. This is all Drupal core, both for the Drupal 7 screenshots and the Drupal 8. So better theme for mobile. In addition, on mobile, if you've ever tried to admin a Drupal 7 website on your phone, you know that it's really a pain. The admin bar sort of wraps around here like this, and I don't know about you, but if I have to hit this structure link, it's dangerously close to the logout, and so I've had a lot of frustrating experiences. I'm trying to hit structure and end up with my fat thumbs hitting logout. So the admin bar has been rebuilt so that it's easier to use on mobile phones as well. It goes sort of vertically like this, and it's actually a responsive toolbar. So when you're using this toolbar mobile, it has all the same features, but in a more spread out horizontal view. Responsive design goes for the forms and the admin theme as well. So over here in Drupal 7, you get this tiny sort of look on your phone, and on Drupal 8, it automatically collapses down to something that fits nicely. All right, next big improvement is WYSIWYG and core. So in Drupal 7 and all Drupals before it, when you install Drupal and set it up out of the box, you would have an editing experience, something like this. No WYSIWYG. You can put in some HTML, but you've got to read some down in here, like what your available tags are and whatnot. In Drupal 8, this is your default editing experience. It includes a WYSIWYG editor, CK editor, and some of the node form parts have been put up here on the sidebar. So these are the things that used to be at the bottom in vertical tabs. They're now on the sidebar, and this works. These actually do collapse back down to the bottom when you're on a mobile phone, but when you're on a wider desktop, they're here on the side. The other important thing is that the published flag, it used to be a checkbox. It now sort of is worked into the button, so this button has a little drop down, so you can see the default is save and keep published, or it will say save and publish if it's new, and you can pop this open from the little arrow, and if you wanted to save and make it unpublished, you can do it right there from the button, because a lot of people miss that checkbox, because it's zipped up into a field set in Drupal 7. So this is an improvement here. I think it'll be easier for people to find how to save unpublished content or to publish unpublished content. All right, inline editing. So you can edit nodes in Drupal 8 without even opening the node form. And I'm going to show you an example of this. I've pre-recorded all my demos for this talk. So I'm just going to show you a video here and I'll talk through it. So the contextual links here allow you on a node to edit individual fields and save them. Okay, you can also edit multiple fields. So you just choose this quick edit option and then you hover over the field that you want and you could change one or more things and then save it with the little pop-up, and it's saved immediately. Okay, don't need to open up a form. This even works for WYSIWYG enabled text areas. So you can see there's like a mini WYSIWYG toolbar there. I can bold some text. I can add things into the text area. And, here I'm going to make a link. All right, so that's pretty smooth. Edit nodes without having to go to the form. File fill multi-select. I'm really excited about this one. This is one thing that really, really annoys me. It's a very minor thing, but I think it's just one of those tiny things in Drupal 8 that are so much better. So let me just show this to you. So if I have a photos, sorry, let me back that up a second. Here I have just a node, and I have an image field down here for photos. So let me play this. If I choose files, I can actually choose a bunch of files with the shift key, and it will automatically fill in all of these files. So upload all the different files at once. If you've ever done this on Drupal 7, you know that unless you have an add-on module like PL upload or something, you have to do them one by one. You can't just select a bunch of them and have it fill in like this. So personally, I'm really excited for that. Form elements in Drupal 8 have been replaced where possible with HTML5 compatible form elements. And several field types have also been combined have been put into core that used to be in contributed modules. So, for example, there is a URL field in Drupal core. You used to have to install the link module to get that. Same thing with email, telephone, and date. Those used to all be add-on contributed modules. They're all now, those field types are all now in core. And they use HTML5 compatible elements, which has this effect here. If you're on a mobile phone and you select the field, so this is a normal text field. I have a normal keyboard. When I go to the telephone number, it changes to a numeric keyboard. When I go to the URL, I get a URL specific keyboard with the .com. Same thing for the email address. I get like an @ symbol, a special keyboard. The photos will allow me to upload photos from the phone, the file field uploads. And if I have a date field, it'll automatically use the native date widgets for the device. And this works on Android too. I'm showing an iPhone here, but this would work on Android with the native Android widgets. The tour module is a new module that's being introduced in Drupal 8. This allows you to build interactive overviews and help documentation for modules, and it's used in Drupal core as well. The only one I could find at this point that's actually implemented in Drupal core is for views. So let's just see a quick example of that. We're going to start up here in the corner where it says tour. So whenever you have an option in the corner, you can click it and you can get sort of a walkthrough where it points at the various buttons and has help text. All right, and so as I said, the only one I could find right now is that's built into core in the development version right now is views, but theoretically these sort of tours and help text will be used throughout the Drupal core system, and module developers can add their own tours for their own module functionality as well. So hopefully this will catch on, and it's easier, I think, for people to go through this than the standard Drupal help. Now let's take a look at what's new for site builders. So, and by site builder, what I mean is people who create Drupal sites but maybe don't do any coding on them. So people who build views, people who have to install and configure modules and things like that. Set up new Drupal sites. So the first thing that you'll notice if you download Drupal 8 is that the directory structure has changed. So if I asked you the question, where do the downloaded modules and themes go in Drupal 7, I hope that all experienced site builders will tell me they go in sites, all modules, and sites, all themes. In Drupal 8, that's no longer the case. They go straight into the modules and themes folder at the root level of the Drupal folder, and all the core files, those used to have core modules and themes in them, all the core files are now in a directory called core. And so I know what you might be thinking, wow, isn't that exactly what we've been taught not to do, or what we've trained other people not to do for years? Because usually it would be only noobs, new people who would stick their modules and themes in the root level modules and themes folder. This is now the recommended practice. However, the sticking modules and themes in sites all modules and sites all themes will still work. So if people follow those old directions, it'll still work. You can also still use specific site names. So if you have a multi-site install, you can still do, sites, domain name, modules, and sites domain name theme as well. That still works. And in fact, if you're going to have specific ones for specific domains, you still have to do them that way. Configuration management. In Drupal 7, we have some issues with configuration management. The main one is that configuration lives in the database, and deploying the config changes from development to staging and production is hard, right? How do you get this stuff out of the database, and how do you put it onto production server without removing all the content from the production server? Because the content is also in the database. You can't just overwrite the whole database. And this is a problem that other systems have. I was just talking to a WordPress developer last week, and he was lamenting that they have this same problem. In Drupal, we have an additional problem, is that we have inconsistent formats for configurations. Some modules use CTools exportable formats. Some people put their things into the variables table. Some configuration might be in their own custom tables, okay, in the modules on custom tables. So it's kind of all over the place. There isn't like a unified way that people store configuration. On Drupal 7, the community has sort of solved this problem by using the features module. And I mean, personally, I love the features module. It allows you to export configuration from the database, push it up to your production server, and then deploy those configuration changes. It works really well. It covers probably 95% of the configuration changes you want. But it's sort of a pain to use. And this is not the fault of the module developers. This is an amazingly difficult task to accomplish because of those inconsistent formats. Wonky things can happen with features. Sometimes you have features that don't revert, or things that, or the features do say that the changes have been deployed and they don't show up. There's just a lot of weird things that can happen with features. So it's not the best approach, but it's the best approach given the underlying architecture of Drupal 7, which is sort of inconsistent and everything's in the database. On Drupal 8, we've got a new solution to this problem, which is a new configuration system where the sort of canonical version of the configuration is stored in YAML files and not in the database. This allows us to, well, it's human readable. This is an example of a YAML file. So it's also human editable. So this, for example, is the display settings for an article teaser. So if I wanted to change the trim length from 600, which we can see right here, if I wanted that to be 800, I could actually hand edit this. These files are just text files, so they can be version controlled. You can deploy them with Git or Subversion, or whatever. And what you end up with, the way this looks in your file layout, is you get under Site's default files, there's this config with a big key here, directory, and then you end up with two folders under here, active and staging. The rule in Drupal 8 is don't hack your active config. Okay, so all of these files, you'll have like a ton of files like this in both active and staging directories. They will most of the time probably look the same, but do not edit your active config. The way you should do this is if you want to hand edit a file or you want to overwrite a file, you do it in the staging, and then there's a synchronization process that I'm going to show you here where you synchronize the settings from staging and sort of import them into the active config. And so I'm going to show you how to do that. Now, I'm not going to show you it with Git and Drush and some of those tools. It is available to do with those tools, but I'm going to show you something that anybody can do. This is just someone maybe who's even just managing their site with FTP, and they've got like a copy on their laptop and a copy on the server. Even people who are working at that level can take advantage of this configuration management system. So let me show you an example of that here in this video. So here I am on the development site. I'm going to go to the configuration, site information, and I'm going to add a slogan to my site. Okay, and you can see the slogan's there, up here at the top. And then I'm going to go down to configuration management. And the site that will actually already detect that I have a change, okay, that I've added this slogan. So I'm going to export the site configuration. And sorry, that went a little quick there, but what that did there, it exported a tar file, which is a collection of all of those configuration files that I showed you in the file, that huge list that was in the folders a minute ago. all those get tarred up into one file, and that gets downloaded. And so then when I move to the staging environment, okay, now I don't have a slogan missing up here, okay. So I would go to configuration, go to configuration management, and hit import. And this is where I'll upload that configuration tar file. And it'll unpack everything and it'll put it into the staging folder. Okay, it's not going to overwrite my active config. There's a second step where I have to choose to import it, where it brings it into the active config. And once that's done, here is my slogan. So I've just deployed that change. Now this actually works for all types of configuration. So if you want to make things like, oh, we want to change which fields are displayed on article teasers, you can make that change and deploy it exactly like I just showed. You can do the same thing with views. Basically all configuration in Drupal 8 and hopefully in contributed modules for Drupal 8 will be driven through the system, so you should be able to deploy them as easy as that. And as I said before, that will also work with Git, where you could bring it down into the staging environment, sort of pull it down to the staging environment and then do that synchronization step to deploy it. In Drupal 8, blocks are entities, and so this might not be immediately obvious the advantages of this, but let me walk through them. So your blocks page looks kind of like you looked before. It doesn't look radically different. The first advantage of having blocks as entities is you can have multiple instances of the same block. So this happens to me all the time where the client, when I'm building the site, they want me to have the main menu at the top, but they also want it in the footer. And so on Drupal 7, you'd probably have to install the menu block module and create like a second menu navigation or main navigation block. In Drupal 8, it's trivially easy. You can make as many main navigation blocks as you want. And same for other blocks if you want to have multiple copies. That's easy to do in Drupal 8. You can also have block types. So blocks are fieldable. So in Drupal 7, you have the custom block, which is just sort of a WYSIWYG block of text. If you want to have multiple different types, this works just like content types in Drupal 8. So you can create multiple different block types, add fields, and manage the display of them, and then allow people to add different blocks of those types. Blocks are also revisionable. So this is really great if you have some block where somebody's coming in and manually editing it on a regular basis. If you ever need to revert that, right now there's no option really to do that in Drupal 7. In Drupal 8, you can just have the revisions turned on by default, and you'll have all older versions of the blocks. Multilingual improvements. I'm not like a super expert on multilingual sites, but I have had to implement it once. And one thing I remember about it is you had to download a whole bunch of different modules in order to there was a set of modules to do content translations and a different set of modules to do interface translations. All of that is built into Core now, and it all basically comes down to these 3 modules. So I think it's a lot clearer and easier to get started with than it used to be. English is no longer required for Drupal, so if you want to have a site that's not English at all, it's possible. Interface translations come through the update system, so there's sort of this page looks like the updates list for modules. You can now do that for interface translations, and they can be updated when they're updated on Drupal.org. And you can go through actually, and I'm not going to go through everything here because like I said, I'm not an expert in this, but you can specify which fields are translatable as part of the field settings. So if you have certain things like URLs or phone numbers, those might not be translatable, but then there might be other text fields that are. You can specify that, and then the interface will be able to show the correct fields that need to be translated when somebody chooses to do a translation. And actually the translation interface is similar to what it used to be. If you've done it before, there's a translate tab on nodes, and you go in there and all the available languages are listed there and you can add translations. That part looks kind of similar. All right, next, views in Core. that's pretty much it. Views, which is the indispensable module for all Drupal 7 sites, is now in core. It looks quite the same. If you look at this interface, you'll see that it pretty much is unchanged. It's changed a lot in its coding, but the actual interface is nearly identical to what it used to be. But now it comes with core. This is going to help a lot because there was sort of a delay in Drupal 7 adoption because people were waiting for views to have a stable release before they built their modules and before they built their sites. Now that views is going to be ready on day one, I think that's really going to help Drupal 8 adoption out of the gate. There are a couple things that are different about views and core in Drupal 8. Well, I think I already mentioned this, but the views are exportable within the configuration management system. So they go through that whole, just like I did with the slogan, you can do the same sort of thing with views. Responsive HTML tables. So if you can specify certain cells to drop out when the table is put onto a mobile phone. And views bulk operations is now in core. So if you've ever used that module before, now it's part of the built-in views module. System pages, because of all those changes that I just mentioned, system pages are now views. So the default content, so when like this right here, this view is what happens when you press the content link in the admin toolbar. Admin people is the link under the people in the link in the admin toolbar. All those things are views. So you can easily override these. Some of these are kind of rudimentary. I mean, I know, for example, in the people one, I always want to add like a field for searching by the user's name and having some other, especially if you have first and last names and things on your site, you usually want to have some way to search for those. It's kind of a pain in Drupal 7 because you have to hide the built-in one and then build your own view. All of these are just views by default. You can just change them. And then, imagine the views are also exportable as YAML files, as I said earlier, in this configuration system. So I imagine that Drupal shops and Drupal developers will probably have a collection of YAML files that they put into every new project that they build, right? A replacement maybe for the built-in people, administration screen, the content administration screen. You could have like 3 or 4 files. Every time you build a new project, throw them in here, synchronize, and boom, you've got your custom admin screens that you like to, without having to rebuild them every time. Okay, web services. This is a big one. This is one that I think sort of fundamentally changes the capabilities of Drupal 8, or of the Drupal project, let's say. In Drupal 7 and previous Drupals, it's always assumed that the output you want is HTML. When somebody makes a request to the web server or to Drupal, it's always assumed that you want HTML as the result. That is no longer an assumption in Drupal 8. Obviously, probably most people who are going to make requests to the Drupal sites in Drupal 8 are going to want HTML. But it can also return XML or JSON representations of the data that's in the Drupal system. So let me show you an example of this. This is, I'm going to show you an example of web services for entities. And remember, all of this comes with Drupal core. So if you've used like the services module and things like that to build web services in Drupal 7, this is way simpler than that to set up. I set this up in about 10 minutes. What you're about to see, I took about 10 minutes to set up and I'd never done it before. So this is web services for entities, this video. So here I'm looking at node 4. And so here's node 4. It's a regular node. It's got some fields. It's got some files, some image files attached to it. And I'm going to copy that URL, and then I'm going to go over here into this other tab where I have a REST client. You could do this with curl or something else if you wanted to use another client. And I have to change the URL a little bit. I have to put /entity/node4. And if I do that GET request, here I will get XML representation of the nodes, of that particular node. Now that's great if you're, if you're a Java developer or something and like XML, but for the rest of us, I think we prefer JSON. It's easier to read, it's easier to parse. And so here is the JSON value, and the only thing I had to do there in order to switch is I added an accept header for application JSON. And so, this gets a little programmatic here, but you can do this with curl, or you can do this out of like if you've got some web app, or sorry, an iPhone app or something, and you want to request this data. Changing these request headers is pretty easy. You can get that JSON data back, and then you can put it into an app or render it in the app. This also works for views, so I want to do a quick example of that. Here's the home page of the Drupal site. Okay, where we see several different nodes displayed. And remember that home page is now a view because that's one of the system pages. So if I go into the view, if I want to expose this as a web service, okay, here's my HTML rendered version. All I have to do is add a REST export display and give it a path. So I'll just give it views/node and save it. And once that's saved, I can come back to my REST client, put in that URL, that path I created, views/node, and I've still got my JSON header there. So, and I will get back JSON representation of that view. So here's the first node in that view. It was node 4, I highlighted it there. And if you scroll down, here's the second one, node 3. And these are actually in a JSON array. I know it's hard to sort of see that on the screen. So I've got all the data for this one. And then here's node 2, right? And it goes on. I think node 1 might be down there too. But so this is, I've got the view has spit back this JSON with the whole list. So I could have, you can imagine like an iPhone app having like a table or something that lists all of the content that's pushed to the front page. And all that happens right out of the box. I think I enabled like 3 or possibly 4 modules in core, very little configuration. I don't have an example of it, but these REST services also support post, patch, and delete, meaning you can add new nodes, update nodes, that's what the patch is for, and delete nodes through the REST interface. So you can imagine building an iPhone app where all of the content and all of is driven by the app, and including creating new content. So I can imagine Drupal sites where you might not even have any sort of web, where the regular user doesn't even view the web. Okay, so, and that's why I said earlier in the talk that I feel like Drupal 8 is really positioned to be a content engine for all different platforms, iPhone, the web, and maybe even devices, right? Because these other computer programs may want to talk to a Drupal site or push content into a Drupal site or pull it out via these APIs. So I'm really excited about this part. All right, themers. What's new for you? Not too much, actually. You get off easy comparatively, especially compared to module developers. The main thing is that Twig is the new templating engine for Drupal 8. It's a Symfony component. It it's not PHP. It's easier to read. It doesn't allow you to run SQL queries in the Twig templates, and all of the templates in Drupal core are in templates folders in the templates folder inside of a theme or inside of a module. So they're a little bit easier to find. They're in less locations. So here's an example. This is node.tpl.php. This is what it looks like on Drupal 7. This same template on Drupal 8 in Twig looks like this. So it's not radically different, but it is easier to read. All the word print isn't in here. I mean, if you notice, I always have to say print this, print that, PHP print all the time. It kind of eliminates that. But most of the same functions are there. You can do conditionals. There's some if and if stuff here, and you can do, no, it doesn't show it here. There's not one here, but you can do loops and things like that in Twig. So it's just something, you can probably pick this up in a couple hours. It's pretty easy transition. Another change, IE8 is not going to be supported by Drupal core in Drupal 8. At least not entirely. It may work for some pages, but system-wide, it's not going to be supported. So that means it's IE 9 plus is required for Drupal 8. So this is going to make themers' lives a lot better, but certain clients who need to support Drupal 8 may have to think about how they're going to, whether Drupal 8 is going to, need to support IE 8. We'll have to think about whether Drupal 8 is a good choice for them. If they still need that kind of backward compatibility, they may have to add that backward compatibility or test to see exactly which things are not going to work on Drupal 8. All right, module developers. This is where the bulk of the changes and the bulk of the sort of controversy of Drupal 8 comes in. Pretty much the entire underlying Drupal code has been rewritten in a new style. This in a new language almost. It's a different sort of flavor of PHP. And so module developers have a lot of work to do to get ready for Drupal 8. Here are a few of the things that have to be sort of learned or relearned in order to do development on Drupal 8. You need to learn about PHP 5.3 and the object-oriented approach of that's available as of PHP 5.3. This includes namespaces, and at the moment, PSR-O, which I'll talk about in a minute. Dependency injection, annotations, certain Symfony components, YAML, which we already looked at, and the fact that some familiar hooks have been deprecated or removed. So I have to relearn how you do certain things in Drupal 8. So let's go through these and talk about, and I'll just sort of show the differences. I don't have time in this particular talk to really do a deep dive. I do have more links into blog posts and documentation if you go to that the main webpage URL for this talk, which I'll show again at the end of the presentation, where you can do a deeper dive into these topics. So let's talk about PHP 5.3 and object-oriented PHP more specifically. So let me show you just an example. So here's a form out of the book module, and I've zipped up the actual code, but we can see the function signatures for book admin edit. And if you're a module developer, then you know the validation function for that form is going to be book admin edit validate. And the submit handler is going to be book admin edit submit. All right, that's a format that all module developers should be familiar with. That's how it's been for several Drupal versions. This is what that same form looks like in Drupal 8. Now it's a little bit, it's a class, and there's a lot of functions here, or a lot of methods here in this class, but actually it's these right here, these three that sort of match up to the old ones. So we have a book admin edit form class that extends form base. And if you know object-oriented programming, that should make sense to you. If you don't, this is an example of where you're going to need to learn that. These three functions take the place of the other three functions we just looked at. So we have build form, validate form, and submit form. And I don't have to preface when I'm working in this object-oriented style, I don't have to preface my method names with the module name all the time because I'm inside of a class. I already have this sort of namespacing from being inside this class. So I actually think that's a big win because that's a real annoyance having to put like your module name in front of everything all the time. Once you get inside this, at least for forms, it looks pretty much the same. This is one area that I think we've got off pretty easy here. The form API is similar, as you can see. All right, namespaces in PSR-O. So in Drupal 8, everything is object-oriented, and all of your code is put into, or not all of your code, much of your code, let's say, is put into class files. Now, those class files are split out. So when I looked at that form a little while ago, this one class just has this one form in it. Now, I think the book module has like 4 different forms in it. So that would be 4 different classes and 4 different files. So if you've worked with Drupal before, you know when you break things out into like a .pages.include or .admin.include, for example, you usually have to do some kind of module load include, or maybe that will be part of your hook menu declaration. But you have to have some way to load in those include files so that the functions can be found. In PHP 5.3, you can create namespaces for your classes. So in this particular example, I'm showing the book controller, and it's in a certain namespace, Drupal book controller. And that namespace can then be used to include a class when it's necessary. And you can actually see that happening down here. These use statements are sort of the flip side. So this namespace declares that this book controller class exists in this namespace. And then these use statements are bringing classes that are specifying the namespace for certain classes that need to be included. And there is a Symfony component that's used at the core of Drupal 8 that will auto-load the dependencies by sort of reading through these use statements, and it will auto-load the things that you need. Now, in order for that to work, we're using Drupal 8 is using the PSR-O standard. And that standard is that basically every level of this namespace needs to correspond to a folder, an actual folder level where the file is in the folder. So, for example, if the class book controller is in the namespace Drupal book controller, then that tells me exactly where this class, it tells me the name that this class has to have, its file name that this class has to be in, and where folder-wise. So if it's book controller, Drupal book controller, then it has to be in core modules, book, lib, Drupal book controller. And the file name has to be bookcontroller.php. Okay, if it's anything else, then this autoloader is not going to work. So there's two things about it. One, you have to learn, okay, I got to make sure these things always match up. The second thing is that with the PSR-0 standard, we have a lot of nested folders. All right, so between the two things of sort of splitting up all your code into individual files and having to sort of nest them down into a lot of folders in order to keep your namespace clean, there's a real explosion in the size of modules, or at least their apparent size. The code size is probably similar, but there's a lot more files, a lot more folders. So here's an example of the book module for Drupal 7, which is actually a fairly big module. Comparatively, I think it has something like 13 files. This is what it looks like on Drupal 8. Okay, it has something like 30 files, and there's a lot of nested folders. Here's that same sort of tree that I was just showing, lib, Drupal book, and then underneath here, form, controller access. There's a lot of nested things under here. So some people, this is sort of more confusing. There's a lot of folders. It's kind of annoying. When you first look at it, it's sort of shocking to see the difference. Personally, I like this better. I know that it looks more verbose, and I'm probably going to have to make a lot of extra folders, but what I do like about it is all of these files are really doing one thing versus like, okay, so those forms, that admin form might have been in a file. I think it's probably in book.admin.inc, but there might be another admin form in there. So there might be 2 or 3 different forms and their validators and their submitters all in one file. That's not going to happen here. Okay, I've got like book admin edit form. That file does one thing. It just handles that form. Same with the book settings form or the book navigation block. So if I want to find out where the code is for the navigation block, it's really obvious now. I don't have to dig or search through sort of all these other files. So personally, I like it, but it is definitely more verbose. Okay, routing. So when we talk about routing, we're talking about tying hook menu, basically tying a specific URL to some piece of code that executes. In Drupal 8, the underlying routing system is now built on top of the Symfony HTTP routing components, and hook menu has actually been split into 2 pieces. or what used to be hook menu in Drupal 7. So hook menu used to do two things. It used to declare actual URL patterns that would correspond to certain code that would get executed. Okay, so you would type in like you would have like items, and you would have the actual path in there. Let me just bring up here's book menu. So like here, right here, you have items, and then this is your actual path. Sometimes the path might have a wildcard of some type in it, like this. And then you would say, okay, so this URL pattern, this particular code gets executed, whatever's in the page callback. Now, this has been split into two. This in Drupal 7, you could also say, in addition to the URL, I also want to display, for example, a menu local task. That means I want to display a tab. So you had sort of two functions happening with this hook menu. You would declare the URL pattern and also declare if you wanted some visual representation within the system. Those two functions have been split apart in Drupal 8. The function of designing or defining URL patterns and what happens when people go to URL patterns, to those URLs, is in this routing.yaml file. So this is an example, again, from the book module. This is book.routing.yaml, and it declares these URL patterns, and then this controller is actually this takes the place of sort of the page callback. All right. And notice that there's some nice shortcuts in here, like if your page callback used to be Drupal get form, like for example back here, I think there was an example, right? This happens a lot where your page callback is Drupal get form and your page arguments is the particular form ID. There's a shortcut here for that where you can just say that you're passing it to a form. So you can declare those routes there, and then there is still a hook menu in Drupal 8, but it is only used for visible sort of menu. It's only used for visible menu routes and to give sort of these titles, any sort of visible manifestation of the route. So things that were strictly menu callbacks probably are not going to be in hook menu anymore. And these hook menus actually will reference back to the URL pattern. So here's an example, route name, book admin, and here's that route defined in the YAML file, book admin. All right, now there's a lot more here. I'm really glossing over this, probably to the point of almost making mistakes here on what I'm saying, but there's more information in the blog post linked on the website. Dependency injection, this is another topic I really don't have enough time to go through. Dependency injection, overall what it means is that if your code relies on some other subsystem of Drupal, it should not be hard-coded to the particular implementation that ships with Drupal 8. And it should be flexible in designed in such a way that it says, I need certain resources, and I need those to be given to me, and then I'll use them. So for example, a database connector, configuration manager, translation service. I need to be able to translate strings. I need to be able to store and retrieve configuration. I need to be able to access databases. Instead of hard coding that to like DB query, which is a specific function in a specific file, you're going to say, I need a database connection service. I need a configuration service in order for this code to run. And then you're going to allow sort of the Drupal system to give that stuff to you at runtime. And the reason for doing this is definitely way more complex, and this is probably one of the most complex changes in Drupal 8. The reason to do this is, well, I guess there's really three. The main one is it keeps your code decoupled. Okay, so you're not dependent on a specific function in a specific file. That decoupling allows you potentially to replace subsystems. So imagine if you want to replace the database subsystem with one that uses MongoDB, that should be possible in Contrib, because if assuming that everybody uses dependency injection like they're supposed to, you should be able to sort of replace that, and then modules will just say, yep, I'm going to talk to the database connector service, and it should work, assuming that the new replacement works correctly. And the third reason sort of builds on that is when you can replace these subsystems, it also makes it a lot easier to unit test, because you can, instead of having to bootstrap an entire Drupal system in order to test one class or one piece of code, you can create some mock objects. Let's say that I have a piece of code that needs 2 services. I could potentially just generate those 2 services or generate mock versions of those 2 services, hand it to that code, and then unit test that code without bringing in potential bugs from the rest of the system. So it makes it much easier to do unit testing. So if I just show a quick example of this, here's the book module again. It declares 4 services, and they are declared in book.services.yaml. And I'm not going to go into the details of all of this, but the one thing I do want to point out is that, like, the book manager service has 4 dependencies. That's what these arguments are here. It's in the class book manager. It has 4 arguments. It needs a database connector, an entity manager, a string translation service, and a configuration factory, something to store and retrieve config from. And that ends up mapping over, here's the book manager class. That ends up mapping over to the constructor for the book manager class, so that here it's database connection, entity manager, translation interface, config factory. So when somebody creates a book manager, that should be sort of handed in or sort of retrieved from the Drupal system, whatever the current one is, and then brought into this particular class, which can then be used. Okay, so like the translation service can be used in the way that the T function used to be used. The connection can be used like dbQuery. Config factory can be used kind of like variable get and variable set used to be in Drupal 7. All right, there's way more to that topic, so please go on the website and look at the details. Next thing, annotations. Annotations, the best way I can describe them is they're a type of code that you write in documentation. In your class comments, you can declare certain properties with these annotations, and this works for several sort of several plugins or plugin-based systems in Drupal 8. So here's an example of, and it takes the place of a lot of info hooks. So in Drupal 7, if you wanted to declare a new block, you would implement hook block info, and you would give it information about the name or some ID number, the delta of that particular block. In Drupal 8, you do that in the class comments, and you do it in a special format. Here I'm showing it to you, where you declare that there is a block. It's got this ID, book navigation. This label is sort of what it shows up as in the interface when somebody's on the block interface. And then down here in the actual class, you would have whatever the rendering is for this, and if it had settings or things like that. This works for other plugin systems too. So for example, if you're writing views display plugins, this is what it looks like. Again, this used to be in an info hook, but now it's in this sort of plugin annotations. There are several Symfony components that have been implemented, that are used as the underlying system of Drupal 8. I think we've actually gone through most of these, or at least touched on where most of these come in. So I'm not going to go through them again. But you may, from time to time, encounter situations where you have to deal with these subsystems directly. So you may have to learn something about them. Maybe not for the simplest modules, but for more complex modules, you might. There's also some additional non-Drupal components that are not Symfony either that are in Drupal 8, such as Composer for dependency management, Guzzle, which is an amazingly awesome HTTP client. This Guzzle takes the place of like Drupal HTTP request or curl. It allows you to pull data out of other web services, but it's got a lot of features and it's super easy to use. It's really great. Aesthetic is for asset manager. It does like CSS and JS aggregation. I also think it can do some things with image resizing. PHP unit for testing, and PSR log to do consistent logging, because now that we have all these different components that are non-Drupal and we have Drupal itself, we need some consistent logging framework to route all the error messages and stuff through, or debugging messages. And so with all these changes, I would say that this really makes Drupal 8 a modern PHP app. This style of code is definitely much more sophisticated, but it is sort of, it is the major standard of new PHP work that is being done today. And so, new projects that are starting today, people who don't have a legacy code base. And so by adopting these new coding standards, this object-oriented style and dependency injection and all these things, it's going to be easier for Drupal to work with the rest of the PHP community. We can integrate their projects like we did with Symfony, and we can also contribute back out to the community without sort of having that translation where we have to take work that other people do and turn it into like a Drupal compatible something, and vice versa. So my game plan for developers: if you haven't started looking at Drupal 8, you need to now. There's a lot of stuff to learn, and you're going to want to get started with it. If you're not familiar with object-oriented programming, that's definitely true. That's going to take a little while to learn, and so you want to get started on that. If you have modules that you either on Drupal.org, or if you have your own private modules that you're using in your business, start trying to port them. See how hard it's going to be to make them work on Drupal 8. Realize that if you start to work on them and port them now, you may have to redo it because they're still changing a lot of things about Drupal 8. So it's possible you may have to do it again, but you're not going to have to redo the whole thing, but you just realize there may be more work to do. One reason to port them now is there's still time for the core developers to change some of the developer experiences, some of the APIs that are available, and examples and documentation and things like that. So if you try to port them now and you run into problems, you can give that feedback to the core team, and then they might be able to make it easier for both you and others. And if you happen to be somebody who knows a lot about dependency injection and object-oriented code and everything, then please help other people, because this is going to be a tough transition for people who have been working in Drupal for a long time, because it maybe haven't sort of seen what's been going on in the larger PHP community. So if you are able to work on these, please help bring some of the other Drupal developers along. All right, so the big question everyone wants to know is what's the timeline? When's it going to be ready? So I talked at the beginning, Drupal 8 development started in March of 2011. Feature freeze was in February of 2013. There was supposed to be an API freeze in July of 2013, but that didn't quite happen. I mean, there's a lot of code that's changed, and so the dates have started to slip here, and especially because some of the developer experiences is real rough right now. It's hard for new developers to make this for Drupal developers to make this transition to the new framework. So there's some reworking of some of the API and cleanup and trying to enhance the developer experience. And so I pulled this graphic off of Drupal.org. We're right now in this alpha release stage. So there's been a couple alpha releases. There'll probably be one or two more at least. And API is still slushy. It's kind of, it can still change, but it's semi-frozen. It'll only change if it's important, which is why it's a time when you can probably start to port some of your modules, but maybe not all of them. I just ran through that. So DX improvements are underway, refactoring ongoing. Also, there is a new initiative that just came up a couple weeks ago to get migrate into core, to make it easier for people to migrate their sites from Drupal 6 or 7 up to Drupal 8 to sort of move the content and stuff. That's a brand new initiative that's sort of coming in here last minute. I've been told that it's definitely getting in, but it's sort of a scramble here at the end. So it's sort of outside of the normal sort of API slushy frozenness, because it's in really active development right now. So how can you help right now? You can fix critical issues in the issue queue. This might be if you're not a core developer already, this one's probably going to be hard for you to do, but if you feel up to it, that's out there. There are definitely critical issues that need fixing. Something that might be easier if you're a developer, you can review and test patches. Actually, you could test patches even if you're not a developer. Reviewing patches, you probably need to be a developer. But basically just people have posted patches that say that they fix a bug. You can install Drupal 8, run the patch, see if it fixes the problem that has been identified. Re-roll or fix failed patches. This is a big time suck for core developers where, somebody posts a patch, it works, then Drupal 8, then a week or two goes by, Drupal 8, that patch no longer works because the code on Drupal 8 has changed so much in that 2-week period, and the patch needs to be re-rolled. That's a really pretty simple way that you can get in there and sort of get some familiarity with the system without needing to know, because re-rolling a patch just basically means moving the pieces around to their new locations because the code is shifted usually a bit, up and down. Documentation. So WebChick has posted a documentation battle plan. As I said, there's a lot of changes, so people are going to need a lot of docs. So you can help writing some of those docs. Here's the URL for the battle plan. And as of today, there were still a few Twig conversions left. By the time you see this, that may no longer be the case. But there were a few template files and things that still need to be converted to Twig. And the Migrate initiative is a new initiative, still needs a ton of work, so there's actually quite a lot of opportunity there if somebody wants to jump in. How to get started? Best way, go to Core Mentoring Hours. If you go to if you've never done core development work, go to Core Mentoring Hours. It's on IRC, and a core developer will help you find something to work on, because that's actually one of the most daunting things. If you go to the issue queue, there's a lot of really smart people having arguments about really complicated, detailed technical things, and it's really hard to feel like you can jump in there if you've never done this before. So if you go to Core Mentoring Hours, those people will help you find something that is appropriate. At the very least, they can tell you, if a solution has been accepted, because a lot of times you'll see argument back and forth about it. They can give you something to work on and help lead you in the direction of how to do it. You can also start upgrading your modules. So there is a DrupalCon Portland session about upgrading your modules. It's linked on the website with this presentation. And the Pants module is an example module that has been upgraded to Drupal 8. It's part of the Drupal. It's referenced in the DrupalCon Portland session. All right. So the upcoming. When can we expect Drupal 8 to be released? So right now we're in that API phase. Dries at DrupalCon Prague said that he hoped to have beta releases by the end of 2013. And RC release candidate 1 release sometime early in 2014. So the release will be when it's ready, hopefully sometime in 2014. I think safely we can say it'll be sometime in 2014, but it's not going to be January. It's probably going to be sometime middle of the year-ish, somewhere in there. So when can you, as a regular user, think about using Drupal 8? If you have a simpler site, like a blog or something, you might be able to do it pretty soon after release. Now that Views is in core, if you're thinking about a blog, it doesn't usually need a lot of stuff other than a content type and a view, and so you might be able to use it whenever it comes out, maybe middle of the year. If you have more complex sites like community sites, if you're doing forums and groups and other kinds of things, then you're definitely going to have to wait a while. Typically it's about 9 to 12 months after a Drupal release for module developers to sort of get up to speed. Now it'll be interesting to see how that changes with Drupal 8. There's a couple things here. First, Views is in core, which I would normally say would sort of make it easier for module developers to get their modules upgraded. However, there are so many coding changes that have changed underneath that's going to be working against them. So it'll be interesting to see if this 9 to 12 months holds or if it gets shorter or longer. And so that's it. That's Drupal 8, what you need to know. I'm Wayne AAKER. Again, the link for where you can get a whole bunch more information about all these topics is here, wayneaker.com/Drupal8. Thanks for listening.